Now, of course, let's move on to the prequels. I know, let's keep the bashing and the grunts down to a minimum. It seems like since these movies came out, it's like the most hated Star Wars topic are these prequels. People forget that before they came out, there were still video games, books, and comic books. And let's not forget, not all of these things were liquid gold. The prequels has become a really hotly debated topic of, a lot of hatred and things like that. Almost, people forget that there was a book called Shadows of the Empire, which has really weird sexual undertones, and it's just funny. And I get it. The prequels are movies. They are movies that people really wanted to see. They were supposed to extend on the backstory of these beloved characters, and many would argue that they didn't fulfill their purpose, or at least they were very disappointing movies. Again, I've spent a lot of time defending these movies, and over time, my opinion on them has changed slightly. So let me just dig in a little bit. Again, I'm not going to go full-on review territory, but I just want to add a few things that I've probably touched on before. Now, I have defended these movies, and I'm going to say something that I probably should not be admitting, but I'm going to. When the Star Wars prequels were first coming out, I found them to be better than the originals. Hear me out. The reason I say that is because in terms of the overall storytelling, the meat in the story, and the actual characters, I thought were juicier in the prequels at first than the characters in the original trilogy. When you look at the characters in the original three films, Han, Luke, and Leia, George Lucas was basically drawing from hero archetypes. So they seem to me more like characters you'd read about in a fairy tale than really fleshed out characters. When you see Anakin, the character, not the actor, but just the character of Anakin, he just seems like more of a real person because he's going through so much in the span of these movies. We saw a little bit of struggle with Luke and Vader in Jedi, struggling with Luke struggling to fight the dark side, making that decision, and Vader coming to terms with his son. We saw a little bit of that. But with Anakin, I felt like we got a bigger scope. We got the full picture with that character. And also we're seeing the Clone Wars, we're seeing the politics, which I understand are not the most interesting aspect of Star Wars, but we're seeing things actually happen. We're seeing how the Republic became an empire, and that was the story that I always wanted to see. So as they were coming out, I appreciated that aspect. But when you look at the overall quality of the films themselves, hands down, the original trilogy is far better. And if I would recommend one over the other, I mean, if you're interested in these films, at one point see all six. Why not? Or all seven now. Yeah, it's when I really sat down and looked. I mean, of course, the original trilogy has that nostalgia value for me. But yeah, it's easy to see that it seems like with the original trilogy, George Lucas invited more outside influence on the films. And here's an example of what I mean. Irvin Kershner, when talking about making The Empire Strikes Back at one point, he said that with Empire, he knew that he had to have humor, but he couldn't have gags. So when you go to The Phantom Menace, which was directed by George Lucas, you've got Jar Jar Binks stepping in dog poo, you've got an animal farting right in the camera. It's a little ridiculous. And then Irvin Kershner went on to say that he knew he had to have a love story, but he couldn't have a lot of smooching and kissing. And then you go to Attack of the Clones, which again was written and directed by George Lucas. You've got a lot of this really awkward dialogue and these kind of weird moments between Padme and Anakin that kind of fall apart. They don't work. So it just seems like, especially with like The Phantom Menace, I think what happened there was George Lucas had all of these ideas, and rather than distilling them down to their essence, which is something he really had to do with A New Hope, he kind of let everything out there and didn't restrain himself at all. And that's why I think The Phantom Menace, looking at it now, feels kind of disjointed. There's even an old documentary, an early documentary that came out with the Phantom Menace DVD, where right after the initial screening of that first cut, Lucas commented that it seemed kind of disjointed. It's a movie where, yes, you do see the younger characters, how they were in this time period before the Empire, but nothing really seems to happen in that movie that really matters. The action is fun. I love the look of the film. But over time, Jar Jar got more and more annoying. The CGI effects don't really hold up as well as they did back then. Jake Lloyd doesn't really do much for me. And it's really hard for me to defend the fact that, aside from the digital characters, everybody, all the human characters speak in a monotone in that film, like nobody really is invested in what's going on around them. The Phantom Menace, it's a flawed film for sure, but there are a couple of things worth talking about. First of all, everybody says that it's a boring film because it gets really into the politics and it's all about trade federations and tax disputes and things, but it's not really. At its core, what the Phantom Menace is really about is about a queen trying to save her people from genocide. Yes, and genocide was something we saw in A New Hope when Darth Vader destroyed Princess Leia's home planet. So it's one of those themes that gets recycled, and it happens here. Of course, you wouldn't know it because that's what the Trade Federation is doing. The taxation of trade routes and all of that, by doing that, they're destroying an entire planet of people. You wouldn't know that because the only line of dialogue that really clues us into that is when C.O. Bibble, he's the old guy with the long beard, he shows up in a hologram, and he says, "The death toll is catastrophic. You must contact me." We don't actually ever see the Naboo people suffering. We don't really see their plight because the film is so focused on setting up events for future movies. But that is the big plot of The Phantom Menace, is that these people are dying and nobody's helping the Queen because there is a lot of corruption in the Senate. And that's what George Lucas was trying to show. That's why there's a lot of politics in that first movie especially. Did we need to see as much as we did? Probably not. But I think what I really respect these movies for is that George Lucas did them his way. He did them without any studio influence, and there's really not a lot of filmmakers that can say that about their films. I also think it's funny that there's this big debate about which is the worst film, The Phantom Menace or Attack of the Clones. After watching both movies, I will say I feel Attack of the Clones is technically a better movie. Seeing the Jedi fight in the arenas, Coliseum style, and seeing Yoda fight Count Dooku with a lightsaber are the real highlights. The reason why this film kind of falls flat, for me at least, I think a lot of people will agree, most of this movie hinges on the romance between Padme and Anakin, and it falls flat. I can't defend the dialogue. I've always thought the dialogue in the movie between them is atrocious, and there's no chemistry between these characters. Anakin genuinely, I mean, some of his advances toward Padme are really kind of creepy, and Padme never shows any interest in him until at the very end when they're about to die. Then she says that she loves him and she's got feelings for him, but we never really feel that in the course of the movie, so it doesn't really work. The action scenes are fantastic. I think they make up for it. I think the movie is a little longer than it needs to be, but the ending cliffhanger with all the Star Destroyers taking off is really cool. Then there's Revenge of the Sith, which I think gets way too much hate. There are a few things in that movie that don't work, such as Anakin's sudden change to the dark side. It happens too abruptly. Pretty much any scene with Natalie Portman, aside from one scene, doesn't work. I just don't like Natalie Portman in these movies. But there's so many things in this film that does work. The opening aerial dogfight when they're on their way to rescue Palpatine. Obi-Wan going to Padme and telling her that he might have to go and kill Anakin. Yoda fighting the Emperor. And I mean, Ian McDiarmid in this film just steals the show. He is the one reason to really watch this film. Seeing his subtle transition from Senator to Chancellor to Emperor is just fantastic, and he nails it. It's hands down. I mean, Revenge of the Sith, believe it or not, is personally my second favorite Star Wars film. So say what you want about the first two movies, but given that this was the last film that George Lucas directed, it shows in pretty much every aspect that this was a story that he really wanted to tell, and it's done so well. Again, there are a few flaws that I'm willing to overlook because there are so many great things about this film, and this one I think is as good as the original trilogy, so I would let this one pass. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the spin-offs like the Clone Wars and Rebels. If you want to see those, watch them on your own time. I did go see the Clone Wars animated movie in theaters, and at the time I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool to hold us over, since there wasn't a new Star Wars movie since after Revenge of the Sith. It was cool to see the characters again, but honestly, the story is really bland in that it's very forgettable. The animation just doesn't have a high production budget, so I don't really even look at it as a film. I look at it as a glorified pilot for the Clone Wars TV series, which is what it was meant to be anyway. So there's that. I have seen the first 3 seasons. of the Clone Wars TV show. I know they get a lot of praise. It just isn't for me, so I couldn't really find myself finishing it. The same with Rebels. I've seen a couple of episodes. It really feels like the same thing as the Clone Wars. It just takes place closer to the original trilogy's timeline, so you do see like Darth Vader in a few episodes I've heard. Again, it's just not for me. And now, talking about Rebels, now we're moving into the Disney era.